There's a moment in every toxic cycle where the narcissist pauses, not because they've suddenly become self-aware, but because something happened that they never expected. You didn't chase them, you didn't run after them when they pulled away, you didn't beg, plead, or try to explain yourself, and in that moment, something inside them cracks, not because they lost you, but because they lost control. Today, we're going to talk about what happens when a narcissist genuinely believed you would chase them, but instead you chose yourself. We'll break down why they're shocked, what this means for your healing, and why this moment is more powerful than you realize. They expected the cycle, and you broke it. For narcissists, relationships are rarely spontaneous or unpredictable. They are built on patterns, carefully studied, calculated, and repeated over time. There is a rhythm to their behavior that becomes almost mechanical. They push and you pull. They withdraw and you chase. They criticize and you try harder to prove yourself. They create tension and you move to smooth it over. Every interaction follows this unspoken script, and over months or years it becomes so ingrained that they begin to assume it is guaranteed. They assume it is inevitable that you will bend to their whims, that you will respond, that you will give them what they want without question. And then one day, you don't. One day, you finally stop playing your role. You don't chase, you don't react, and you don't seek to repair what they want broken. It is a subtle shift, perhaps unintentional at first, but it shatters everything they believed about their control over you. It is not just surprising, it is destabilizing. They are confronted with the impossible, a human being they assumed they had fully mapped, a predictable presence in their life, is now outside their reach. The rules have changed and they didn't anticipate it. Imagine a narcissist as someone who has always flipped a light switch, expecting the room to light up. Day after day, they flip it and the light comes on. It doesn't matter how often it flickers or how they try to manipulate the wiring, they know the light will respond. But then one day, they flip the switch and nothing happens. The light remains dark. That light was you, and for the first time, they realize you are no longer responding to their control. They cannot understand it because all their life they have been trained to expect that the world bends to their actions. You, who they assumed would always follow the script, are now absent from their story, and it terrifies them. There are countless stories of this because this pattern repeats in so many lives. One woman shared her experience of being in a relationship where arguments always ended with the same ritual. Her partner would storm out, full of anger, expecting her to chase him, call him, apologize, or plead. Even when she hadn't done anything wrong, she did it for years. She tried to make sense of his behavior, to repair the invisible cracks, to keep the relationship afloat even as her own sense of self eroded. She believed that her efforts, her patience, and her love could change him, but the truth was nothing could. The pattern wasn't hers to fix. After years of therapy, self-reflection, and reclaiming her own boundaries, she reached a point where she could sit on the couch and do nothing. When he left in anger, she didn't pick up the phone. She didn't chase. She didn't try to explain herself or fix what wasn't hers to fix. And when he returned hours later, he was furious and confused, demanding to know why she didn't care. The confusion in his eyes was unmistakable because he had never encountered resistance before. He had assumed she would always respond, but this time she didn't. This time she was free. And in that freedom, she found her power. This is a moment that every person in a relationship with a narcissist can understand, the moment when you finally stop feeding the machine. Narcissists rely on the rhythm of their partners, the predictable reactions, the constant chase, the emotional responses that feed their ego and maintain their sense of dominance. They plan for it, manipulate for it, and take it for granted. They do not consider the possibility that you could choose differently, that you could recognize the pattern, see it for what it is, and simply step out of it and stepping. out of it is more powerful than most people realize. It is not a matter of cruelty or vengeance. It is a declaration of self-respect, a refusal to participate in manipulation, and a reclaiming of your own emotional space. By breaking the cycle, you are no longer a participant in their control. You are no longer predictable. You are no longer a source of constant validation. This forces them to confront something they cannot tolerate, that they are not in charge of you, that the control they assumed they had is in fact an illusion. It is important to recognize that this shift does not happen overnight. It is the result of self-work, reflection, and a commitment to your own well-being. Narcissists are experts at spotting weakness and hesitation. They have been trained to exploit every opening, to test every boundary, and to assume compliance. So when you finally stop chasing, when you finally reclaim your presence and refuse to feed their need for power, the effect is profound. It is a disruption of the script they have lived by for years, and that disruption is what shakes them to the core. The impact of breaking the cycle is not just psychological, it is transformative. When you stop chasing, you start to reclaim your time, your energy, and your dignity. You stop apologizing for things that are not yours to fix. You stop bending yourself to match the rhythm of someone else's chaos. You start to realize that your worth is not defined by someone else's expectations. And for the narcissist, that realization is shocking because it is completely outside their experience. There is also a subtle power in your inaction. By simply choosing not to respond, by simply choosing yourself, you force them into an unfamiliar space, reflection, confusion, and even desperation. They may try to provoke a reaction, but your emotional autonomy remains intact. They may attempt to reestablish the old dynamic, but it no longer exists. You have broken the pattern, and in doing so, you have introduced a variable they cannot calculate. And that is the essence of why breaking the cycle is so important. It is not about defeating the narcissist, it is about winning yourself back. It is about taking back control over your own life and refusing to be a pawn in someone else's manipulations. It is about understanding that your energy is precious, your emotional health is paramount, and that you are allowed to step away from toxicity without guilt. The shock the narcissist experiences is simply a byproduct of your growth, a reflection of the power you reclaim simply by choosing to honor yourself. Your silence confronts them with their own insecurity. One of the most destabilizing experiences for a narcissist is encountering someone who refuses to feed their need for attention. Narcissists live in a world where they are the center of the emotional universe. Every interaction is a mirror reflecting their own importance back to them. Their power depends on it. They rely on others to react, to validate, to notice, to chase. This is not just a quirk of personality, it is a fundamental structure of how they navigate relationships. They expect engagement, and when engagement is withheld, it throws them into uncharted territory. Silence is a weapon in the hands of the self-aware. But more than that, it is a mirror. When you stop responding to the provocations, the games, and the manipulations, the narcissist is forced to confront themselves, not the version of themselves they present to the world, but the fragile, insecure, and needy version that lurks beneath. They are confronted with the reality that their perceived control was dependent entirely on your participation. They begin to realize that without your reactions, they have no influence. Their confidence, their sense of superiority, their carefully curated facade of strength, all of it becomes hollow when met with your quiet refusal to participate. This is not speculation, it is observable in countless relationships. A man recounted how his ex-partner would routinely provoke arguments knowing he would respond with worry, guilt, and explanations. It had become a rhythm in their relationship, almost hypnotic. One day, after years of being caught in this cycle, he decided to step back. He stopped responding immediately. He stopped chasing her with calls and messages. He stopped apologizing for things he hadn't done. For the first time, she encountered silence. At first, she tried to bait him, sending messages designed to provoke anxiety. But he remained still, no reaction, no chase, just calm, deliberate detachment. The result was striking. He later shared that she became anxious, almost frantic. She asked mutual friends about him. She checked his social media repeatedly. She even tried subtle attempts to make him jealous. The silence was eating at her because it confronted her with the truth. Her usual tactics no longer worked. She realized that she had relied entirely on him continuing to react, to care, to respond. In that silence, she saw herself. Not the charming persona she projected, but the insecurity she had hidden from the world. And he, for the first time, could observe her disorientation with clarity. This phenomenon works because narcissists rarely have the opportunity to sit with themselves. They are so accustomed to being mirrored by others that they rarely reflect on their own emotions or behavior. They rely on others to fill that space. Your silence strips that away. It forces them to reckon with their own inadequacies, the gaps in their self-esteem, and the fact that the emotional influence they assume is theirs to command is not guaranteed. They cannot understand that someone could simply exist without responding to them, without being drawn into their drama. Silence is more than absence, it is empowerment. For you, it is not about proving a point, it is about protecting your own mental and emotional space. It is about setting boundaries that no one, not even a narcissist, can cross without your consent. But for the narcissist, your quietness is terrifying. They are used to manipulation, being a game where they always have the upper hand. When the expected reactions are missing, they are forced to confront a reality they cannot manipulate. They are not omnipotent, and you are not a tool. There is an almost poetic justice in this dynamic. You see, narcissists spend years, sometimes decades, perfecting strategies to provoke, control, and destabilize those around them. They assume they are untouchable because their tactics have always worked. But all it takes is one person deciding not to participate, one person refusing to feed the fire, to chase, or to react. That refusal is more powerful than any argument, any confrontation, or any explanation. It exposes their insecurity in the starkest terms because it cannot be denied or rationalized. It simply exists. This doesn't happen overnight. For many, learning to maintain silence in the face of provocation requires courage, practice, and an understanding of one's own boundaries. It requires recognizing that their discomfort is not your responsibility, that their need to control or manipulate is not yours to satisfy, and that your emotional autonomy is not negotiable. And when you maintain this calm, unshakable presence, the narcissist experiences something they rarely, if ever, feel: uncertainty, fear, anxiety, the realization that their power was contingent on your engagement, and that engagement is no longer automatic. Consider the subtlety of how this works in everyday life. You might stop sending the quick responses that they expect. You might decline to explain yourself repeatedly. You might not react to their provocative comments. And every small act of quiet resistance chips away at their certainty. They start replaying interactions in their mind, questioning why you didn't act normally. They begin to feel the weight of their own reflection. And in that reflection, they are confronted with the emptiness of their control. It's also worth noting that silence does not mean you are passive. It means you are deliberate. It is an active choice to protect yourself, to reclaim your emotional energy, and to stop feeding someone else's ego. Silence becomes a form of communication more powerful than any words you could speak. It tells them, I am here, but not for your manipulation. I exist, but not to serve your needs. I have value, and it is mine to decide how to share it. That message is incomprehensible to a narcissist because it is entirely outside their expected rules. By holding this space, you force them into a confrontation they cannot script or control. They may attempt to provoke you, test you, or tempt you back into old patterns. But if you remain silent, if you continue to prioritize your own well-being over their need for validation, you teach them something they cannot easily learn: that not everyone is predictable, that not everyone is a tool for their ego, and that your worth does not depend on their approval. They never imagined you could see your own worth. Narcissists have an almost uncanny ability to spot vulnerability. They thrive on it. They build their relationships around it, relying on the assumption that their partner will doubt themselves, bend under pressure, and seek validation at every turn. They depend on the idea that you will prioritize their needs over your own, that your self-esteem can be manipulated, and that your sense of worth can be measured by their approval. Every word, every action, every subtle reaction is a reflection of this invisible hierarchy they have constructed, where they sit at the top and you are expected to orbit around them. For them, the concept that you could see your own value, unshaken, unwavering, independent, is almost unimaginable. They cannot fathom that someone could exist in their presence without giving them control. When you start to recognize your own worth, when you begin to honor your boundaries, when you stop justifying their behavior or diminishing yourself to maintain peace, it shatters the entire framework they have relied upon for years. They are forced to confront the fact that their influence was never absolute. It only existed because you allowed it to. One man shared how his ex-partner always assumed he would chase her whenever she withdrew. Every disagreement, every cold shoulder, every period of silence from her was expected to trigger his anxiety, his apologies, and his attempts to fix the situation. It was a rhythm that had been drilled into him over time. He had always thought that if he loved someone, he had to prove it constantly, through calls, texts, and gestures of reassurance. But after years of self-reflection and learning to recognize the toxic patterns in the relationship, he reached a turning point. He realized that he didn't need her approval to validate his worth. He didn't need to bend or beg to be seen or loved. When he stopped chasing, when he refused to engage in the predictable cycle, her reaction was striking. She became flustered, confused, even angry, because the narrative she had built in her mind, that he would always chase, always return, always comply, was no longer true. She had assumed that he couldn't survive without responding to her, but he had discovered something she never expected. His value was not dependent on her acknowledgement. He had found a sense of self-respect that she could not manipulate, and that recognition became a mirror for her own insecurity. This is a common experience for many people who have endured narcissistic relationships. For years, you may have been taught, implicitly or explicitly, that your feelings are secondary, that your needs are less important, and that your validation comes from their attention. The narcissist relies on this imbalance. They depend on it for their sense of control. But when you finally assert your own worth, when you act in alignment with your own needs and refuse to chase their approval, you expose a truth they cannot accept: that their power is conditional, not inherent. Seeing your own worth is transformative because it changes the entire dynamic. The narcissist can no longer predict your reactions. They can no longer manipulate your emotions at will. Every expectation they had of you, every assumption that you would react, apologize, or compromise is thrown into question. Your self-awareness becomes a form of resistance, and that resistance is more threatening than any argument or confrontation. It is important to understand that recognizing your worth is not an act of arrogance or defiance. It is an act of clarity and self-preservation. Narcissists often attempt to make you feel guilty for asserting yourself, framing your boundaries as selfishness or rejection. But the truth is, valuing yourself is not only healthy, it is necessary. It is a declaration that you will no longer be a participant in a system designed to diminish your confidence and manipulate your emotions. One of the most powerful aspects of this realization is how it changes your internal dialogue. Instead of asking, "Why am I not enough?" You begin to affirm, I am enough. Instead of seeking constant validation from someone else, you find it within yourself. This shift is disarming to a narcissist because their influence thrives on doubt. When you are no longer doubting yourself, their tools, the guilt, the criticism, the withdrawal lose their potency. You stop feeding the system that once held them in control. There is also a psychological ripple effect that occurs when you embrace your worth. Others begin to perceive the change in you. You carry yourself differently. You speak with confidence, and you no longer tolerate mistreatment. This creates a feedback loop. Your boundaries are reinforced, your self-esteem grows, and the narcissist is left confronting not only their inability to control you, but also the reality that they may have underestimated you from the very beginning. Your realization of self-worth is the ultimate shock to a narcissist because it defies their assumptions. They have built their world on predictability, on the belief that others exist primarily to meet their needs. When you step outside of that, when you see and honor your value, it creates cognitive dissonance for them. They are forced to confront a truth they cannot manipulate, that your value is intrinsic, independent, and beyond their control. The power of recognizing your worth extends beyond interactions with the narcissist. It allows you to reclaim your life in ways that were previously unimaginable. You stop sacrificing your happiness for someone else's validation. You stop tolerating emotional abuse. You start prioritizing your well-being, your goals, and your relationships with people who honor and respect you. And for the narcissist, this independence is a shock that cannot be ignored. They never anticipated that you could see yourself clearly and refuse to play the role they assigned you. Ultimately, when you recognize your worth, you break the cycle that the narcissist depended upon. You no longer chase, you no longer react out of fear or obligation, and you no longer allow your sense of value to be dictated by someone else's manipulations. Your self-respect becomes your shield, your guide, and your power. And for the narcissist, that moment when they realize they cannot diminish you or provoke you as they once did is both destabilizing and undeniable. It is a moment they never imagined, and it is a moment that defines your liberation. They realize their backup plan failed. Narcissists operate with a kind of calculated confidence. They believe they have a safety net in every relationship, a backup plan that ensures they never lose the influence they crave. They assume that no matter what chaos they create, the people around them will ultimately return to the pattern they've established. They think you will always chase, always respond, always engage, and always validate their sense of importance. It's a worldview built on the expectation that others are predictable and that emotional manipulation will always work. But when you stop participating in that pattern, when you refuse to chase, refuse to react, refuse to validate, their carefully constructed plan collapses. For a narcissist, this is not just surprising, it is profoundly destabilizing. They are confronted with something they never expected. Their influence is not absolute, their emotional guarantee has failed, and the system they rely on for control is broken. They may try to mask it to recover quickly, but inside, a sense of panic begins to take root. This failure of their backup plan manifests in subtle and often frantic ways. They may check your social media repeatedly, trying to gauge your emotional state from afar. They may reach out indirectly through mutual friends, probing for information, looking for ways to reestablish control. They may send a casual text or comment designed to provoke a response, testing whether the pattern can still be restored. They might attempt to elicit guilt, jealousy, or anxiety, hoping to pull you back into their orbit. Every action is an experiment, a desperate attempt to regain the certainty they assumed they had. One woman shared how her ex would disappear for days after arguments, fully expecting her to reach out, apologize, or make herself available on demand. For years she did. It was a cycle she had come to dread but felt powerless to break. Then, after months of therapy and conscious self-reflection, she chose a different path. The next time he withdrew, she did nothing. She did not call. She did not apologize. She did not chase hours turned into days, and she simply existed in her own space. His response was telling. He became frantic, checking in indirectly, sending messages to friends, even trying to provoke her into reacting through social media posts. The pattern he relied upon had failed, and for the first time he confronted the reality that his control over her was not guaranteed. The collapse of their backup plan shakes a narcissist because their entire sense of power depends on predictability. They assume people will behave in ways they can anticipate, that their manipulations will always work, and that no one will challenge their authority over emotional dynamics. When someone refuses to follow the script, they are confronted with their own limitations for the first time. Their usual tools, anger, guilt, manipulation, charm, lose their effectiveness. They are forced to grapple with a reality they are ill-prepared to navigate, that you have agency, that your choices are independent, and that their assumptions about your behavior were wrong. This failure also exposes the narcissist's vulnerability. They have relied on emotional leverage to maintain dominance, but when the leverage disappears, they are left with uncertainty, fear, and frustration. They may try to regain control through subtle tactics, sending a text to provoke curiosity, leaving a small gift, or feigning concern, but these attempts often backfire. They are reacting not from strength, but from desperation, and desperation is visible to anyone who has learned to recognize it. The beauty of this moment, from your perspective, is that it highlights your own power. You no longer operate under the assumption that their approval or attention defines your value. You have stepped out of the cycle of manipulation, refusing to be pulled back into a role that diminishes you. Every attempt they make to regain control only reinforces the reality that their plan has failed, and that failure is an affirmation of your independence and your growth. It is important to recognize that narcissists may not openly admit that their strategy failed. They may act as though everything is normal, or they may attempt to rationalize your lack of response as a temporary anomaly. But deep down, the cracks in their confidence are unmistakable. They can feel it in the uncertainty of your absence, in the lack of emotional reactions they expected, and in the clarity you demonstrate by staying outside the cycle. Their backup plan, their safety net of guaranteed manipulation, does not exist anymore, and that realization can be as disorienting as it is profound. This is why choosing not to chase is one of the most powerful tools you have in reclaiming yourself. It is not about punishing the narcissist. It is about asserting your own boundaries, protecting your energy, and refusing to participate in a dynamic that no longer serves you. By stepping away from the predictable pattern they relied on, you force them to confront their own limitations while simultaneously reclaiming your freedom. When you stop feeding the cycle, you also redefine the rules of engagement. You show that your responses are no longer automatic, that your emotions are not their playground, and that your choices are your own. This creates a shift in power that is subtle but undeniable. The narcissist may try to recover their influence, but they are now operating in a space where the outcome is no longer guaranteed. For the first time, they face the reality that they do not have control over you and that their backup plan has failed entirely. In that failure, you see something important: the illusion of their omnipotence. Narcissists rely on people believing they are untouchable, that their manipulations are inevitable, and that no one can resist them. When you refuse to chase, you strip away that illusion, you expose the truth. Their control only works when you participate in it, and once you step outside the cycle, you are no longer bound by their expectations. You reclaim your autonomy, your emotional space, and your power, and that is a moment they can never fully anticipate or contain. Your strength forces them to confront what they lost. There comes a moment in every relationship with a narcissist when they are forced to face a reality they never anticipated, that the person they once assumed they could control has stepped into their own power. This is the moment they realize that their strategies, their manipulation, their games, everything they relied on to maintain dominance no longer work. It is not just frustrating for them, it is shocking, destabilizing, and profoundly disorienting. Your strength becomes a mirror that reflects everything they cannot face within themselves, their insecurity, their limitations, and the consequences of underestimating you. Narcissists thrive on dependence. They expect you to be predictable, emotionally available, and responsive to their needs, whims, and manipulations. Their sense of superiority and control is maintained by the certainty that you will always bend to the pattern they have established. But when you stop chasing, when you refuse to engage in their games, when you prioritize your own well-being over their expectations, you dismantle that illusion entirely. Suddenly, they are confronted with something they did not account for: your autonomy, your independence, your self-respect. One woman described this vividly in her own experience. Her partner had always assumed she would chase him after arguments, no matter how hurtful his behavior had been. She had spent years apologizing for things she did not do, explaining herself endlessly, and trying to make him feel secure in a relationship that was inherently unstable. Then one day she decided to stop. She chose herself. She stopped reacting to his provocations, stopped chasing, stopped giving him the emotional energy he relied on. The result was immediate and profound. He became visibly unsettled, confused, even desperate to understand why the dynamic had changed. For the first time, he realized that he had lost something he took for granted, and that loss was entirely his responsibility. This confrontation is a turning point for the narcissist because it forces them to reckon with their own assumptions. They begin to see, sometimes for the first time, that they cannot force someone to stay in a pattern of compliance. They realize that their power is not inherent. It is contingent on the willingness of others to participate. And when that participation is withdrawn, they are left with the undeniable truth: they have lost what they assumed would always be theirs. Your strength in this moment is not just resistance. It is a declaration. It says, without words, I will no longer be defined by your expectations. I will no longer be manipulated by your tactics. I am not yours to control. Every silent refusal, every boundary you enforce, every moment you choose yourself over their manipulation is a testament to your own power. And the narcissist cannot ignore it. They see it, they feel it, and it confronts them with the consequences of their own behavior. It is important to understand that this moment can provoke a range of reactions. Some narcissists may try to reassert control through anger, charm, or guilt. Others may attempt to provoke jealousy or uncertainty, testing whether they can regain their former influence. Some may retreat, trying to preserve a sense of superiority even as they feel it slipping away. Every response is a reflection of the shock they experience when confronted with your independence. They never expected you to reach a point where your sense of self outweighed their need for control. Real-life experiences make this clear. A man recounted how his ex would manipulate and provoke, expecting him to chase and appease her every time. When he finally stopped, she reacted with disbelief. She could not understand how he could remain calm, maintain boundaries, and prioritize his own well-being. Her confusion and frustration were evidence of the shift. She had lost the predictable control she once assumed she had, and it terrified her. That terror, born from the recognition of your strength, is a powerful acknowledgement of your growth and autonomy. Your strength also has a cascading effect on your own life. When you refuse to chase, you are no longer trapped in cycles of anxiety, self-doubt, or emotional exhaustion. You reclaim your energy, your peace, and your clarity. You begin to live in alignment with your values, not the whims of someone who seeks to dominate you. And in doing so, you create a life where your worth is defined by your own standards, not by the approval or attention of someone who cannot recognize your value. This is why the moment your strength forces a narcissist to confront what they lost is so profound. It is a silent revolution. It is the unspoken assertion that you are no longer available for their manipulation. It is the recognition that they cannot dictate your worth, your emotions, or your choices. And it is the first time they are forced to see the consequences of their own behavior in the starkest, clearest light. In essence, your strength is not just a shield, it is a revelation. It demonstrates that the power they assumed they held over you was never real. It exposes the fragility beneath their confidence, the insecurity beneath their facade, and the limits of their influence. And it shows you something equally important. That your liberation, your clarity, and your dignity are yours to claim without apology or compromise. Every act of refusal to chase, every moment of self-prioritization, every boundary you enforce chips away at their perceived control. And in that process, you teach a lesson that cannot be unlearned, that your value is inherent, your choices are your own, and your strength cannot be diminished by anyone who fails to see it. The narcissist's shock, confusion, and frustration are evidence of the power you hold, and the peace, clarity, and freedom you gain are the rewards of standing firm in your own truth. You not chasing wasn't an act of cruelty. It was an act of self-preservation. It was the moment you chose peace over chaos, clarity over confusion, and dignity over dysfunction. And while the narcissist may feel shocked, destabilized, or even angry, the real story here is your transformation. You broke the cycle, you reclaimed your voice, you stepped into your power, and that's something they never saw coming.